Hello everyone, welcome to an Area 49 sponsored workshop, DSLR Photography Basics. I'm going to be your instructor today, Thomas Crocker, and let's go ahead and get into it. So this first slide here is going to basically break down the inner workings of a DSLR camera. I've got one right here in front of me. I'm going to pop the lens off so you guys can see the inside. So light is going to pass in through the lens of your camera. It's going to hit a mirror that's right inside. You can kind of see it there. And then it's gonna send that image up to another mirror and send it also through the viewfinder so you can kind of see it. But once the camera is on and you're taking a photograph, see if you can see this happen. That was a really long exposure, but it was just an example so you guys could see when I press the shutter, that mirror that's sending the image up through the viewfinder to my eye is going to pop up out of the way, and all of the light from whatever scene that you're taking a photograph of is going to hit the image sensor that's behind that mirror. And that's how the photograph is created. And today we're going to go over 3 settings that we have complete control over that's going to affect kind of the look of our image and how bright or dark our image is. So exposure is the amount of light which reaches your camera sensor, which is that thing behind the mirror, and it's the crucial part of how bright or dark the photo appears. So if you're using a modern DSLR camera, mirrorless camera, or even older film cameras, when you look through the lens, you should see this, and it's called a light meter. And this is going to kind of help you out to properly expose your image. And the settings up under it, so shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, are the 3 settings that we have control over that will affect how bright the image is going to be. And this centerpiece is the light meter, and you see that little tick under the arrow in the center of the light meter. That actually moves depending on how bright the situation that you're in. So if it's a very dark room inside, that little tick mark is going to be all the way over to the -3, and that means your image is really dark. If you're outside on a super bright sunny day, might be over towards the +3, which means it's going to be a really bright image. But what you want to do is basically change these 3 settings to where that tick line is right in the center, and that way you know that your image is exposed properly and it's going to be a well-lit photograph. So again, the 3 settings that we're going to go over are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. The first one that we're going to talk about is aperture. So within your lens, there's an opening that you have control over the size of that opening. And the size of your aperture in your lens is going to be dependent on that specific lens. Like some are different than others. So f-stops are the measurement of that opening inside your lens. I actually have an older lens where you can adjust this manually. On modern cameras, you just do it by a dial on the camera, on the back of the camera. But in older lenses, you actually had the ability to turn a dial on the physical lens to open and close the aperture, which is gonna let more light in or less light in if it's closed down like this. And the measurements on here, you need to think about these as almost fractions. So the smaller the number, the larger the opening, but just think of it as like 1/1.4 or 1/16. A 16th is a lot smaller than, a half. The larger the f-stop number, the smaller the opening is going to be, and the less amount of light that you're going to let in to hit that image sensor that's in the back of your camera. So what does aperture do? It controls the amount of light that's hitting your sensor, and it also has a side effect. All of these 3 settings that we're talking about today are going to have a side effect too, a visual side effect. And the side effect for aperture is going to be that it controls your depth of field, which I'm going to show you right now. So these are 2 great examples of how you can use aperture in different ways. Small apertures like f/22, when the lens is closed basically all the way down and there's a very small opening, that's going to give you a wider depth of field. And what that means is more of your photograph is going to be in focus. It's not going to have that portrait mode look that you can get in iPhones. But if you open up your aperture wide, like f1.8, you're going to get that very narrow depth of field, almost that portrait mode look. Like in the second example here, the subject is in focus, but behind them is completely out of focus. And in the image on the left, this is a small aperture, wider depth of field. So, the tip of that first canoe all the way back to the mountain range is all in focus. And this is very popular in landscape photography, and large apertures with shallow depth of field or narrow depth of field is very popular for portrait photography. Here's some examples of some very narrow or shallow depth of field. Again, this effect is very popular in portrait photography, but can be used in a wide range of photos. Here's a few examples of some very small aperture photos where the majority of the image is in focus. And again, this is popular in landscape photography, architecture photography, where the photographer usually wants most of the image in focus to show the details of everything within the image. The second setting we're going to talk about today is shutter speed. And this one's interesting. This is the amount of time that the shutter is open, which we have full control over. So we can take a very quick photograph or a very long photograph. Just interesting to think about. Like some of these examples I'm going to show in a second are like 30-second photographs. And the side effect to shutter speed is that it either freezes motion or creates motion blur, depending on the photograph and your subject within the photograph. So here are two examples of the same scene with very different shutter speeds. One is a very quick photograph, a 640th of a second, the one on the left, and then the image on the right is a 2.5 second photograph. And these have very different looks and effects because of that shutter speed difference. So the image on the left, it's gonna freeze any motion that's happening in that photograph. So you can almost see every little drop of water. It's frozen that motion in time. But the image on the right, it's a 2.5 second photograph. And so during that 2.5 seconds, that water is rushing and moving. So it's going to create movement in your photograph that looks like this kind of dreamy ghosting effect. Here's some examples of some very quick photographs, some very high and fast shutter speeds. So the image on the left is an 8,000th of a second. This was in a greenhouse where it was a water pump and water was just flowing and gushing out of this very, very quick. But an 8,000th of a second was able to freeze that motion to where you can see every drop and every ripple. The image on the top right is a dolphin impacting the ocean, diving in the ocean. This was on a deep sea fishing trip that I was on, and we were able to capture some dolphins swimming right by the boat. These are some examples of some longer exposure photographs. So the shutter speeds for these are very long. The image on the right in particular is a 30-second photograph. This was outside at nighttime, and a friend took a flashlight. I set up the camera on a tripod, started the 30-second photograph, and she was able to write her name with the flashlight. And so you can even see there's a bunch of her in the image, but there's only one of her. But basically how the flashlight was lighting her up, it kind of gave her this ghosting effect where it seemed like there were a lot of people in the photo, but it's just one person writing their name with a flashlight. The third and final setting that we're going to talk about today is ISO. And this is basically the sensitivity of your image sensor. We have control over that. The side effect for this one is going to make your image more or less grainy. So it kind of degrades your image the further you push this. So this is kind of like your last ditch effort. Here are two examples of the same shot with very different ISOs. The image on the left is at ISO 25,600 and the image on the right is at ISO 100. And you can see how much cleaner the image looks on the right. So again, this setting, you want to keep it as low as you can. The closer to 100 that you can get it, the better the image is going to look and the cleaner the image is going to look. But sometimes, depending on the situation, the lighting in the room, we may have to bump this up. We may have opened our aperture as wide as it can go, and we're taking a handheld photograph. The suggested shutter speed for a handheld photograph is about 1/100. So 100th of a second. You don't want to go much slower than that because you're going to introduce handshake in your image. So say you're shooting at 1/100, your aperture's wide open, but your image is still too dark because maybe you're inside or it's at nighttime or something like that. So this is when you would push up your ISO to kind of compensate to make your image brighter. Your image sensor is gonna absorb more light, but it's gonna sort of degrade your image and become more grainy and more sort of pixelated looking, like the image on the left. So these are some scenarios when we would want to push that ISO number up. If we're shooting indoors or with very narrow apertures, and at nighttime, if we're shooting handheld especially, or maybe our subject's moving, say we're shooting like I don't know, nighttime volleyball event or something like that, where people are moving around, we need sort of a quicker shutter speed to freeze that motion, but it's dark outside, so we're gonna have to push the ISO number up to compensate for that, to get a well-exposed image, properly exposed image that's not so dark. Here's some examples of when I had to boost the ISO up. Two of these photos were shot in an aquarium, which is a very dark space. But if your other settings are basically maxed out at what you can do, you can push your ISO up and still get a pretty good image. The image in the bottom right was a dance performance inside with not a lot of lighting. So this is definitely one of those situations where you're gonna have to bump your ISO up. I was shooting this handheld too with moving subjects, so a great scenario where you're gonna have to bump up that ISO to get a properly exposed image. And just to review, we push and pull these three camera settings to create our exposure. Aperture is the size of that opening. The side effect of that is going to be your depth of field, so how much of your image is in focus. It can create that portrait mode looking photograph, or you can have the majority of your photograph, all of it in focus for landscape shots and things like that. Shutter speed is going to be how long that opening is open, and the side effect of that one is going to be it's going to create motion or it's going to stop motion in its tracks. And that's a creative decision that you can make. And then the last and final setting is ISO, and that's the sensitivity of your image sensor. And we're going to want to keep that as low as we can, but we'll have to push that up for certain situations to make our image brighter and properly exposed. When, say, we don't have a tripod to set our camera on to take a longer photograph, or if we're shooting a very dark situation, we may have to bump that up to get a well-lit photograph. Thanks for tuning in to our Area 49 workshop, DSLR Photography Basics. Hope you guys were able to learn something new today, and good luck out there capturing some photographs.